Chapter 3 of Headlong Hall by Thomas Love Peacock. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Chapter 3 The Arrivals. In the midst of that scene of confusion thrice confounded, in which we left the inhabitants of Headlong Hall, arrived the lovely Caprioletta Headlong, the squire's sister, whom he had sent for, from the residence of her maiden aunt at Carnarvon, to do the honours of his house, beaming like light on chaos, to arrange disorder and harmonise discord. The tempestuous spirit of her brother became instantaneously as smooth as the surface of the lake of Llanberis, and the little fat butler placed Got and St. Taffet and the beautiful Tamsel, for being permitted to move about the house in his natural pace. In less than 24 hours after her arrival, everything was disposed in its proper station, and the squire began to be all impatience for the appearance of his promised guests. The first visitor with whom he had the felicity of shaking hands was Marmaduke Milestone, Esquire, who arrived with a portfolio under his arm. Mr. Milestone was a picturesque landscape gardener of the first celebrity, who was not without hopes of persuading Squire Headlong to put his romantic pleasure grounds under a process of improvement, promising himself a signal triumph for his incomparable art in the difficult and therefore glorious achievement of polishing and trimming the rocks of Llanberis. Next arrived a post-chaise from the inn at Capelkerrig, containing the Rev. Dr. Gaster. It appeared that when the mail coach deposited its valuable cargo, early on the second morning, at the inn at Capelkerrig, there was only one post-chaise to be had. It was therefore determined that the Reverend Doctor and the luggage should proceed in the chaise, and that the philosophers should walk. When the reverend gentleman first seated himself in the chaise, the windows were down all round, but he allowed it to drive off under the idea that he could easily pull them up. This task, however, he had considerable difficulty in accomplishing, and when he had succeeded, it availed him little, for the frames and glasses had long since discontinued their ancient familiarity. He had, however, no alternative but to proceed, and to comfort himself as he went with some choice quotations from the book of Job. The road led along the edges of tremendous chasms, with torrents dashing in the bottom, so that, if his teeth had not chattered with cold, they would have done so with fear. The squire shook him heartily by the hand, and congratulated him on his safe arrival at Headlong Hall. The doctor returned the squeeze, and assured him that the congratulation was by no means misapplied. Next came the three philosophers, highly delighted with their walk, and full of rapturous exclamations on the sublime beauties of the scenery. The doctor shrugged up his shoulders, and confessed he preferred the scenery of Putney and Kew, where a man could go comfortably to sleep in his chaise without being in momentary horror of being hurled headlong down a precipice. Mr. Milestone observed that there were great capabilities in the scenery, but it wanted shaving and polishing. If he could but have it under his care for a single 12-month, he assured them, no one would be able to know it again. Mr. Jenkinson thought the scenery was just about what it ought to be, and required no alteration. Mr. Foster thought it could be improved, but doubted if that effect would be produced by the system of Mr. Milestone. Mr. Escott did not think that any human being could improve it, but had no doubt of its having changed very considerably for the worse, since the days when the now barren rocks were covered with the immense forest of Snowdon, which must have contained a very fine race of wild men not less than 10 feet high. The next arrival was that of Mr. Cranium, and his lovely daughter, Miss Cephalus Cranium, who flew to the arms of her dear friend Caprioletta with all the warmth of friendship which young ladies usually assume towards each other in the presence of young gentlemen. Miss Cephalus blushed like a carnation at the sight of Mr. Escott, and Mr. Escott glowed like a corn poppy at the sight of Miss Cephalus. It was at least obvious to all observers that he could imagine the possibility of one change for the better, even in this terrestrial theatre of universal deterioration. Mr. Cranium's eyes wandered from Mr. Escott to his daughter, and from his daughter to Mr. Escott, and his complexion in the course of the scrutiny underwent several variations from the dark red of the peony to the deep blue of the convolvulus. Mr. Escott had formerly been the received lover of Miss Cephalus, till he incurred the indignation of her father by laughing at a very profound craniological dissertation which the old gentleman delivered. Nor had Mr. Escott yet discovered the means of mollifying his wrath. Mr. Cranium carried in his own hands a bag, the contents of which were too precious to be entrusted to any one but himself, and earnestly entreated to be shown to the chamber appropriated for his reception, that he might deposit his treasure in safety. The little butler was accordingly summoned to conduct him to his cubiculum. Next arrived a post-chaise carrying 4 insides, whose extreme thinness enabled them to travel thus economically without experiencing the slightest inconvenience. These 4 personages were 2 very profound critics, Mr. Gall and Mr. Treacle, who followed the trade of reviewers, but occasionally indulged themselves in the composition of bad poetry, and 2 very multitudinous versifiers, Mr. Nightshade and Mr. Maclaurel, who followed the trade of poetry, but occasionally indulged themselves in the composition of bad criticism. Mr. Nightshade and Mr. Maclaurel were the 2 senior lieutenants of a very formidable corps of critics, of whom Timothy Treacle, Esquire, was captain, and Geoffrey Gall, Esquire, generalissimo. The last arrivals were Mr. Cornelius Chromatic, the most profound and scientific of all amateurs of the fiddle, with his 2 blooming daughters, Miss Tenorina and Miss Graziosa; Sir Patrick of Prism, a dilettante painter of high renown, and his maiden aunt, Miss Philomela Poppyseed, an indefatigable compounder of novels written for the express purpose of supporting every species of superstition and prejudice; and Mr. Panscope, the chemical, botanical, geological, astronomical, mathematical, metaphysical, meteorological, anatomical, physiological, galvanistical, musical, pictorial, bibliographical, critical philosopher, who had run through the whole circle of the sciences, and understood them all equally well. Mr. Milestone was impatient to take a walk around the grounds, and that he might examine how far the system of clumping and levelling could be carried advantageously into effect. The ladies retired to enjoy each other's society in the first happy moments of meeting. The Reverend Dr. Gaster sat by the library fire in profound meditation over a volume of the Almanach des Gourmands. Mr. Panscope sat in the opposite corner with a volume of Rees' Cyclopaedia. Mr. Cranium was busy upstairs. Mr. Chromatic retreated to the music room, where he fiddled through a book of solos before the ringing of the first dinner bell. The remainder of the party supported Mr. Milestone's proposition, and accordingly, Squire Headlong and Mr. Milestone leading the van, they commenced their perambulation. Chapter 4